Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us here at De Montfort University. Good evening, and thank you for joining us here at De Montfort University for what promises to be an informative and empowering session about transgender athletes in sport. I'm Professor Martin Polly. I'm the Director of the International Centre for Sports History and Culture here at De Montfort and a Professor in History, and I'm your host and Chair for this evening. This special event about transgender athletes is being held as part of DMU Pride and of LGBTQ+ History Month. It brings together academics who are working on the experiences of elite and grassroots transgender athletes, along with two transgender athletes at different stages of their sporting lives, who are both involved in sport and in support and advocacy for a more inclusive sporting world. And I'm honoured that DMU Sport has invited me to host such an important conversation. And I wish to thank Emily Fennington from DMU Sport, and from Event, Sandra Henry, Krishna Patel and Kate Bright, who are making all the technology and all the other aspects of tonight possible. The debate around transgender athletes' rights is a hot topic in sport, one that has implications for policy and practice from grassroots to the Olympic Games. It's a subject that has major implications for sports people at every level, ranging from logistical matters of changing rooms and team selection, right through to elite level regulation about who can and can't compete in certain categories at events like the Olympic Games. It's a subject that has inspired critical questions, controversies, and sadly, abuse. And as such, it's something that can act as a barrier to many people who are feeling isolated, ignored, marginalised, and excluded. And what we hope to do this evening, thanks to our academics and our athletes, is to find out more about all of the issues involved in transgender sport and hear how two transgender athletes have negotiated these debates in their own sporting lives. And we hope that this session will be both informative and empowering. The session speaks to some key initiatives here at De Montfort University. The first relates to DMU Sport, who are committed to creating an inclusive sporting environment through the delivery of inclusive activities, training for all student leaders, supporting different campaigns and initiatives, and hosting events that discuss how sport can be more inclusive for a whole wide range of communities. We believe that sport is for everyone, no matter how they identify. The second initiative is that we link into No Space for Hate, a DMU and student union initiative designed to challenge inappropriate behaviours and provide practical support to students who are victims, survivors, or witnesses of hate and harassment. DMU is a diverse institution, and we want to continue to create an inclusive and respectful environment for all students and staff. And we hope that the conversation that we hold tonight will help to underpin these brilliant projects. So the structure for tonight is as follows. First off, our two visiting lecturers, colleagues from Loughborough University, will give speed lectures on different aspects of the theme. I'll then hold personal story interviews with our two athletes who are here tonight. And then all four speakers will come back together for a panel discussion, and at the end of which we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. Members of the audience, if you have a question at any time, please type it into the chat bar. We will pick them up towards the end of the session, but the sooner you get it in, the better, and we'll then be able to structure the conversation around those. So let's first off then move into the first part of the evening with our two speed lectures. And first up is Dr. Gemma Whitcomb, Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Loughborough University. Gemma's research interests are broadly centred around gender, the self, and mental health across a broad spectrum of populations, including trans and non-binary individuals. She has particular interest in the interplay between physical activity and well-being, and thus inclusion. She is the founder of the Gender and Sport Mini Centre for Doctoral Training at Loughborough University, where 6 PhD students are researching the critical issue of trans and non-binary inclusion in sport. Her speed lecture is called More Than Just Medals, Inclusion in Sport, and she's going to begin by giving us some definitions of what we mean by transgender before then going into her lecture. So Gemma, great to see you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Martin. Thanks for having me here this evening. So as Martin said, my talk today is titled more than just medals, inclusion in sport. And this is going to focus on the importance of inclusion at grassroots levels, really, of transgender people and some of the issues that this throws up. So I'm going to share a couple of pieces of ongoing research that we have. Now, just to give the definition at the beginning, when we talk about transgender individuals, we're talking about people whose gender identity, how they experience their gender, doesn't align with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So when they were born, based on their primary sex characteristics, a doctor says boy or girl, and this just doesn't align. This can include binary trans people, so people whose gender identity more aligns with the opposite gender, but also non-binary people who don't really experience their gender as either exclusively masculine or feminine. In terms of my background then, much of my research is focused on mental well-being in the trans community. So my research and that of others worldwide has shown that trans people tend to have poorer mental well-being than their cisgender counterparts, particularly prior to gender-affirming interventions. Now, this is, of course, with the caveat that not all trans people do want to have medical interventions. But overall, what we tend to see is more anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide, interpersonal problems in trans people. And part of the cause of this, of course, is the increased stress that somebody will experience and the increased discrimination that is experienced as a result of living in a world where gender is seen as so binary. So my next slide shows how this binary kind of plays out. Now, this isn't the case in all cultures, but certainly in our culture, population is really regarded as kind of two distinct groups, very masculine and very feminine groups of people. And while this really can be conceived to be led by biological sex, how somebody's assigned at birth, it's actually also heavily just a product of our culture. So if we just flick onto the next image, our culture is really what is emphasizing and reinforcing this divide. And if we flick on again, please, when we look at sport, this really is one of the most influential, powerful, visible institutions that's reinforcing this kind of gender binary, this gender divide. Now, sport is described as one of the most enduring institutions that holds up actually discriminatory and sexist ideologies. And really, we only have to look at disparities in things like the attention that male sport gets compared to female sport, the amount of funding that male sport gets compared to female, and also some of the kind of ridicule and actual harassment that female athletes and female pundits are on the receiving end of in this sphere. So sport isn't always a nice place to be, I guess. But if we flick onto the next slide, at the most basic level, sport is also an exceptional tool, really, to boost well-being. So it's therefore of a concern that trans people, just by virtue of their gender identity, might be excluded from this. Now, this exclusion might not be physical, so it might not be about kind of location and physical barriers to access, or indeed about rules and regulation. Sometimes, as this study shows here, where we were actually just exploring experiences of bullying in young gender diverse people, this exclusion can come around as a result of general difficulties engaging in everyday activities. So in this study of nearly 300 young people, we found that bullying was most prevalent at school, as you might expect. But this is also where a lot of people experience the first experiences with sport, and where a love of sport can develop and be nurtured. And that's clearly then missing if people aren't experiencing this in the same way because of bullying in the school environment. And what's important to note is that sport provides an avenue for social connectedness and for social support. And these are things that we know are protective factors against poor mental well-being in all populations. So if that's not there, then this is a problem. If we click onto the next slide, as well as sport allowing people to connect with each other, and that, as I said, is a big part of good well-being, how someone connects with their sport identity is also really important. And this is something that's not always easy to navigate for trans people. And because of the largely kind of binary nature of sport, as I described at the beginning, it can be really disaffirming for some people. So this research here asks people to take photos of things, anythings, that affirmed or disaffirmed their gender identity. And what we found is that sports images featured heavily in the photographs that were taken. And you can see here with the top one, Serena, who's taken a picture to show something that really disaffirms her gender identity. And she's saying that in order to participate, she's forced to present in her male form just to do the thing that she loves. And that's really disaffirming and really inauthentic for her. But then on the contrary, we've got Jess here, who found that sport actually helped them to connect with their gender identity. So it can be affirming if it's allowed to be. If you click onto the next slide, in addition to having to navigate the kind of gender binary in sport, the other, I want to say, kind of false binary seems to be this issue of inclusion versus fairness. Like the two are often presented as kind of competing or opposing ideas. So we've got a real need to understand and to develop inclusive practices. So how can we improve participation for everyone? But if you flick onto the next image, please, we also have to understand, acknowledge and work within any limits that we might find there are over fair participation based on kind of physiology. And this is something that I know Joanna's going to be talking about next. But if we're just focusing on this first one, inclusion, which is what I want to do, there are many sports where sex segregation is really just a kind of historical legacy. And new ways can be developed and new ways should be developed. And I just want to talk about one example of this. So on the next slide, this is an image from a local Derbyshire strength competition called Limitless. Now, this has been running for 2 years. It didn't run this year, just gone because of COVID, and you know, who knows what will happen this year. But this is a all gender inclusive strength competition. So essentially, anybody can join and competitors are put into categories based on their ability. Now, this kind of competition, the idea behind it isn't new. We see this in different sports already, but it's new in this context. And to promote as an all gender inclusive competition was something novel. But it has a number of advantages, as you can imagine. So, you know, it's fair. Anybody can enter, and the categorization means that it's done on ability, and obviously therefore it's open to all. But also going forward, one of the advantages of looking at sport in this way is that it can normalize this idea of non-sex segregated sport. So the more we have events like this and competitions like this, the more people can start to see outside of the box that not everything has to be male competition and female competition. It also equalises some of those disparities that I talked about in the beginning that we see in gendered sport in terms of how much attention is paid through it and how much funding it gets. So we did interviews with people that took part in this and also people that spectated in it, and the response was overwhelmingly positive. We did find some people still express concerns around fairness and the challenges of doing this in different types of sports. So maybe things where you can't categorise based on ability. But one really interesting finding was a difference between some people who thought that maybe promoting something as all gender inclusive might serve to further marginalise trans people. It suddenly becomes a competition just for them. And opposed to that, there was the view that maybe some people wanted LGBT only competitions because they're a safer space. So this was really interesting, really, this balance between being inclusive versus being kind of exclusive, an exclusive club. Now, the final point I just want to talk about is in relation to the need, on the next slide, please, of not always focusing on barriers, but looking at sports that are inclusive and what they do that facilitates that, why they've been able to do that. So roller derby, as I'm sure everyone knows, has a reputation for being really inclusive for the LGBT plus community, but also for cis women as well, who reported in this study that it's a place where what they look like, what size they are, what shape they are, doesn't really matter. But what we have actually seen in roller derby is that there's been a lack of focus on rules, regulation, what's fair, strength debates and things like that. And what we found in the study is that the rise in this attention on this issue might actually be serving to put an unnecessary spotlight on these issues. So some people actually reported that they thought there was a discussion around this now in roller derby, which would be to the detriment of the sport. So this is really interesting, actually, and this is a bit of the fear, I guess, that this need to regulate now in terms of being inclusive might mean that some sports that were inclusive are now put under a spotlight, and different regulations might actually be to detriment. And that would be really unhelpful and a real step backwards, really. So overall, we've got to find new ways of doing sports, sporting events that challenge this unnecessary segregation where they can. And as I said, that might be easier in some sports than others, but we need to normalise this way of looking at sport through that lens, really. And for me, fundamentally, the benefits to physical and mental health are so profound that changes need to be championed, changes need to be supported, and we need to not get overwhelmed where we can afford not to be with the rules and regulations, which actually might be of detriment. But thank you very much. I think that's my time. Thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Gemma. Some great stuff in there that we'll be able to return to, I think, in the panel. Some really interesting themes you brought up there. So thank you very much. So what we're going to do now is to move on to our second speed lecture, which moves us really from, if you like, the grassroots and psychology, more elites and physiology. And our speaker for this is Joanna Harper. In 2015, Joanna published the first peer-reviewed article containing quantitative analysis of the athletic performance of transgender athletes with differing hormonal values. Since then, she's collected subsequent retrospective data on transgender athletes and is currently engaged in a prospective analysis of 2 transgender athletes. She's the author of the book Sporting Gender, The History, Science and Stories of Transgender and Intersex Athletes, published by Rowman and Littlefield Harper in 2019. And she's also authored many articles on gender diverse athletes in both peer-reviewed publications and in the Duke University Law Review. Joanna has served as an advisor on transgender and intersex athletes for multiple sporting federations, including, since 2015, the International Olympic Committee. In 2019, Joanna relocated to Loughborough University, where she's now engaged full-time in the study of transgender athletic performance as a PhD researcher. Joanna, it's fantastic to have you with us, and her speed lecture is called Transgender Athlete Performance Analysis. Joanna, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. So I'd like to take an analytical look at the questions regarding transgender athletes. And so can we move to the next slide, please? So one of the things that many detractors of trans women in sport suggest is that trans women have advantages over cisgender women. And look, this is absolutely true. Even after hormone therapy, transgender women will be on average taller, bigger, and stronger than cisgender women. And these are advantages in many sports. However, we allow advantages in sports. As an example, we let left-handed fencers compete against right-handed fencers, even though it's well documented that left-handed fencers have many advantages. What we don't allow in sport is overwhelming advantages. We don't put heavyweight boxers into the ring with flyweight boxers. And the difference is that despite the advantages that left-handed fencers have, left-handed fencers and right-handed fencers can engage in meaningful competition. There's no meaningful competition between heavyweight boxers and lighter boxers. The bigger boxer wins every time. So the question when it comes to transgender women in sport isn't, do trans women have advantages, but rather, can trans women and cis women engage in meaningful competition? And how should we answer that question? Well, if we move to the next slide, I would suggest that rather than looking at one or two individuals, we should look at broader population statistics. And I'll use the example of the upcoming Olympics. Many people have been concerned that New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard may compete in the Olympics in Tokyo later this year. And first of all, we don't know whether there's going to be a Tokyo Olympics. And secondly, that the qualifying procedures for weightlifting are kind of complicated, but Laurel has an approximate 50% chance of being in Tokyo. There are a couple of other trans women athletes who have maybe a 10 to 20% chance of making it to Tokyo, but that's it. In fact, the trans athlete with the highest probability of being in Tokyo is a Canadian footballer named Quinn. And Quinn is a non-binary but trans-masculine individual who won a bronze medal in the Montreal Games, or sorry, in the Rio Games as part of the Canadian soccer team. And barring injury, Quinn will again be competing for the Canadian football team in Tokyo. So probably what we're looking at is Quinn and maybe one or two trans women in Tokyo. Again, we don't know if the games are going to happen or if all countries will show up. But if they do, there'll be approximately 5,000 women competing in the Tokyo Olympics. Trans people make up between 1% of the population, roughly 1 in 150. So of these 5,000 women, one would expect to see that there would be approximately 35 trans women and 30 to 35 trans men competing in the Olympics if we had equal representation. So despite all of the hoopla over a few trans individuals, trans athletes are going to be hugely underrepresented at the Tokyo Olympics. And this is sort of a macro way of looking at this question. I think that if we go to the next slide, we should also look at it from a more micro scale. What happens to the individual trans athlete when they go through hormonal transition? And in 2015, I published the first paper looking at this. I gathered 200 race times from 8 trans women runners before and after transition. Collectively, they were more than 10% slower after transition. And this number is very important because male runners, all the way from sprinters to marathoners, run approximately 10 to 12% faster than similarly trained female runners. One of the biggest confounding factors is age. Athletes get slower as they get older. And so I factored out aging by using World Masters Athletics age grading tables. And you can see in the picture in the bottom, the times get slower as you move from the left to the right, which is pre to post transition. But if you can see the numbers are clustered around 0, meaning the age grades stayed approximately the same. It was a good start, but it's only 8 athletes in one sport. And as a non-academic, non-PhD person, I had very limited opportunities to do anything more than this. So if we move to the next slide, I was thrilled in 2018 when Gemma contacted me pretty much out of the blue and asked me if I would be willing to move to England to earn a PhD by studying trans athletes. I moved here in the fall of 2019, and then the pandemic hit. But we still are soldiering on, and we have 2 studies that are underway. We have a laboratory study where we bring trans athletes into the lab, we get baseline measurements on them, and then as they go through hormone therapy, we bring them back into the lab and see how their performance changes in terms of size, strength, speed, and stamina. The other study that we have going is sort of a follow-up to my study, where we look at competition results before and after transition. And these have to be done in so-called centimeter gram second sports, where we can look at results in absolute. We measure lifting in grams, for instance, and racing in seconds. So if we go to the next slide, these are some data from one distance runner in the current competition results. She started to transition hormonally in 2020, and she's on a regimen where for the first 150 days, she was on estrogen only, and then started an anti-androgen agent at day 150. And that's designed to bring the testosterone levels down from typical male levels to typical female levels in a gradual way, and estrogen levels up from typical male to typical female levels, again, gradually. And you can see in the slides, or the pictures on the left, that was achieved. So what about her racing time? So if we look at the picture on the right, and it's important to note that these racing times are expressed in seconds. 1,020 seconds is 17 minutes, and 1140 seconds is 19 minutes. So in the 2 years before she started her transition, she was running just under 17 minutes for 5,000 meters or 5 kilometers. And then when she started her estrogen, she got a little bit slower. She was running between 17 minutes and 17:20 in the 2 races that she undertook prior to starting the anti-androgen. The second dot you can see to the right was a race just days before she started her anti-androgen. And then within 60 days of starting the anti-androgen, she was running over 19 minutes for 5K. And that's 12% slower than she was prior to starting hormone therapy. So in 200 days, she had gotten 12% slower. Again, this is the difference between similarly trained male runners and female runners. This 200 days brought her up to November of 2020, and I collected these data from her in December. Over the next year, I will be collecting quarterly data from her, and March will be the first time I will do so again, and then every 3 months thereafter throughout 2021. And I'm very interested to see what her race times will do over the next year. There are other athletes that we are looking at this study, and we are in the early stages of gathering some very interesting data. And so can we go to my last slide, please? So there's a huge amount of controversy over trans athletes, and especially trans women in sport. And yet the impact that these athletes are having is extremely small. Trans athletes are still hugely underrepresented at all levels of sports. I can tell you from firsthand experience that trying to do research on transgender athletes is extremely challenging, but it's a very important thing. The contribution that Gemma's team, including me, is making here at Loughborough is very important, but to see real progress, we're going to have to go to multi-institutional, multi-nation studies where we can start to see some real numbers. And the last thing I would like to say is that I do have a book out. If people want to go into these topics in more depth, it would be an interesting read. And if you bought the book, you could help support my PhD studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanna. It's one of those my SoundCloud is kind of moments there at the end. Thank you very much. Excellent stuff. Thank you so much, Gemma and Joanna, for their academic overviews, and we'll be meeting them again in the panel shortly. And it's fantastic to hear of this wonderful pioneering research project. Obviously, Loughborough is the leading institution in the UK for sports science research, and it's wonderful to hear that you're working on this important area. What we're going to do now is move on to our two athletes' stories. And I really can't stress enough how privileged we are to have Helena and Chloe with us to share their experiences. We're going to start with Helena Rachel Thomas, who's joining us from Glasgow today. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to run these two as interviews. I'm sort of in chat show host mode, as it were, now, one at a time, but then we can bring some common themes together, and then we'll come back together again in the panel. So first off, Helena Thomas. Welcome, Helena. Helena is Business Support Officer with Leap Sports Scotland, which is an organisation that works for gender inclusion, for greater inclusion for LGBTI people in sport, and works against homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia in sports settings. They're committed to breaking down structural, social, and personal barriers which are preventing lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex people across Scotland from accessing and participating in sport in Scotland. Helena is also an active hockey player with Hillhead Ladies in Glasgow, and we'll hear more about that later on. I think we need to own up on this, really, is that I first met Helena, I said a long time ago, but I'm a historian, so I've actually got to say in 1984, when we were at university together, when Helena was the captain of the second 11 football team, and we first met on the muddy football fields of West Wales, a team, I must say, in which I played with absolutely no distinction whatever. It was great to play. Helena, it's great to see you, and thanks again for joining us today.
Nice to be here, Martin. Nice to be here.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. So what we're going to do then, Helena, is just to go through a few questions, really. So can you start off really sort of looking back, without wanting to say, tell me about your childhood, can you maybe talk through what kind of role sport played for you as a youngster growing up? Obviously, quite a long time, really, before your transition. What role did sport play in your life?
It's always been important. I went to a traditional grammar school, and it was expected that sport was part of that curriculum, very much so. It was expected that you would play, in this particular case, rugby, hockey, and cricket. And to some senses, you were measured as a pupil by your success on the hockey field, or the field, or the cricket field, or whatever. So more by accident, I suppose. But I always, I played at school. I enjoyed it. I would never claim to have been particularly good at it, but it became part of me in a sense. Not just playing it, but I support the local football team and all that kind of thing. So sport's been there since I was 11 years old, really, I suppose.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks. And now you've blogged a little bit about your experiences in some incredibly, I think, moving and powerful ways. And in one of your blog posts, you talk about how, and I'm quoting you here, that, quote, you had known something wasn't quite right, but you'd never been able to put your finger on it through your younger days before your transition. Can you maybe tell us something about how this knowing something wasn't quite right manifested itself in your sporting life?
I think, if anything, I as I say, I knew there wasn't something wasn't quite right. So to that extent, I felt that I should. I suppose I felt that I should then become more competitive, super sporty, to try and, if you like, I don't know whether to say to get it out of me or to deal with it, but it's a way of, well, something's not right here, so I need to throw myself into sport as a from whatever it is that I feel isn't right at the time. And to be honest, at the time, I had no idea what it was. I mean, we're talking a long time ago. But yeah, so sport became an escape from that. And I suppose in some senses, I became very, very competitive, because it's a way of proving to myself that perhaps, I could cope with it, whatever it was. And again, I had no idea what it was.
That's really fascinating. Again, I think for anyone in the audience who is experiencing the kind of things that Helena's talking about, it'll be really interesting if you want to ask questions later on. Helena, you then, we're moving on, I know, to something incredibly personal to you, and thanks so much for agreeing to share. You went through a period of intense and immense personal crisis in 2010. And I think it could be very helpful and empowering to members of the audience if you could, take us through this in your own way and at your own speed.
Yeah, I think, well, the simple fact is in 2010, I attempted suicide. I actually attempted twice. And at the end of that, the second attempt, I ended up in the local psychiatric hospital. Now, up to that point, I think I was trying to live up to the expectations of being who I thought I should probably be. And although at the time I didn't recognize this, I would look back on it now and saying one of the reasons for it, not the only reason, but one of the contributing factors was that I wasn't being authentic.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that I was trying to match up and live up to something that deep down I knew I probably wasn't. But I did go, as a result of that experience, I started having counselling and talking to people. And that was really the start of the process that led me to where I am now. So at the time, it wasn't particularly, I wouldn't directly relate it to my situation, but it was a contributing factor, certainly. Yeah.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for that. And did sport, so through this time of great turmoil and challenge and self-examination that's going on in your life, did sport continue to play a role? Clearly, it was very important in your younger days.
It did. Yeah, I can remember being in May 2010 and desperately wanting to come out because I was scheduled to go on a hockey tour at the end of the month to Holland, and I really didn't want to miss that. And I sort of, on balance, I could probably have benefited from a little bit longer in hospital, but I wanted to get out and I wanted to get back to doing what I enjoyed doing. And I think doing that is a sign that you're back to some kind of normality, even though perhaps not quite as much as you'd like to give the impression. But no, I was desperate to get back to it.
Yeah. So did sports kind of form a thread of continuity, perhaps, through your life?
In all the sort of swings and roundabouts of life, sports is the one constant. It's been there all the time. As life has taken you off in all sorts of different directions, sports carried on through the middle. As I say, watching it, playing it, whatever.
And you're you officiate as well, do you?
Yes, I umpire as well. I qualified as a football referee when I was about 16. I did that for a few years, but so now I'm a qualified hockey umpire.
Excellent. That again, really, really fascinating stuff. I'm hoping that this will resonate with our audience. So you then, as we mentioned earlier, you then picked up a hockey stick again in your early to mid 50s. I'm trying to be
but that's generous.
Early 50s. Talk us through that. How did you come out of retirement?
I retired in 2017 for two reasons. One, because quite frankly, I was getting too old and I felt that I couldn't do it anymore. And the other reason was that I knew at some point in the following year that things would start to happen from a transition point of view. Yeah. And I just thought the two were incompatible. So I retired and I was quite happy with that decision. I was, reconciled myself to the fact that's the end of it. It's been good, but it's done now. But I got the job with LEAP in 2018, and one of the projects we run is sort of LGBTI taster sessions during a summer program. And through that, there was an event with Hillhead Hockey Club, and I went along to that, and partly through work and partly thought I can still run around for half an hour and play hockey. I saw some of the guys I played against for a long time previously, and the girls at the club were really welcoming, and they said, "Why don't you come and play?" And I thought, well, why? And then I thought, well, why not? To be honest, they were keen. They said, come and play some summer matches, which are mixed games. Mm-hmm. That went quite well. And in the end, they said, why not join the club properly? Sign up. Went to training, signed up, became a fully sort of legitimate member of Hillhead Hockey Club. Had no expectations that would happen. It sort of happened by accident, but it happened because they sort of said, "Come along, you can do it. Why not?"
Excellent. And hopefully there are no more imminent plans for retirement. I'm hoping.
Well, let's hope.
Let's push all sorts of barriers here. Now, from picking up on some of the comments that Joanna and Gemma have made, there's obviously some evidence that trans athletes are sometimes finding barriers to participation in sport. Is that something you've experienced at all in hockey?
None at all. I have to be honest and say it's not a dramatic story of fighting against the odds. The club were very welcoming. The Scottish Hockey's inclusion policy is first class. I think the biggest issue was in my own head at one point, where I was concerned about the reaction from the opposition once we started to play league games. Because by then, Hillhead were fine, but I was wondering what the opposition would be like. Not a problem at all. And then I started umpiring other games, and essentially, there's been no issues whatsoever.
That's great. That's so good to hear. And again, hopefully that'll inspire other people to make that move. Can you tell us a little bit, Helena, about LEAP, about what it does and about what your role is within
that? A fairly very good summation of what we do. As you said, we're there to work to break down barriers and to improve and increase participation for LGBTI people in sport, and work against biphobia, homophobia, transphobia that prevent people from participating. My job within there is more to do with, if you like, the office management side of things, but we do get involved obviously with a lot of the projects that we hope to run. Sadly, at the moment, with the lockdown, we've not really been able to do as much work as we would like. But we do generally work with governing bodies. We work with schools. We work with clubs to help develop policies for them if they're not sure what to do. And we work with partner organisations across Europe.
Fantastic. Sounds like you're doing wonderful stuff there. This is a tough one, I guess, to ask, but if you could just give one bit of advice to people, particularly, I guess, students who are listening in today, who are involved in sports clubs and societies at university or in the community, if you could give them one bit of advice about how they could make sport more inclusive for trans people, what would it be?
Well, I think from my own experience, the thing that struck me more than anything was how welcoming Hillhead Hockey Club were when I first went along, and there was no questions, no issues at all. It was acceptance from day one, and I think if you can offer people that, it's that feeling of security and acceptance and being welcomed, and then once you feel part of something. That was the thing that I would say more than anything.
That's brilliant here, and again, that resonates so clearly with what you were saying earlier on about sport being the thread through everything. It's that belonging, it's that the camaraderie, the membership of a community. I think that is so important. Helena, thank you so much. We'll come back to you in the panel in a little while, and then obviously audience members will be able to ask questions as well. But thank you so much for giving us the taste of your experience. Thank you so much. And we won't go to them yet, but the questions are already piling in. We've already got 4 in the chat there, so there's going to be lots to come to later on. Helena, thank you so much. We're going to come now to our second athlete interview with Chloe Quinn. Before we start, I do need to stress that earlier on in the rehearsal, Chloe was having some slight time lag problems. Chloe, are they still there?
I'm not too sure how yours sounds.
No, it sounds perfect. It's good. When we were speaking before, there was about a 5-second delay, but you picked me up right away, so that's great. So, Chloe, welcome. This is, I believe, Chloe's second visit to events at De Montfort, although the first one was physical, and this one's virtual. So, Chloe is a footballer currently playing in goal for Bedworth United Ladies FC in the Women's National League. Unlike Helena, I'm too old to have played on the same side as Chloe, and I would have been way too useless to have made the 11 with you. Anyway, Chloe, but welcome. It's great to see you here. And I guess what we're going to do is have some similar questions to what we just went through with Helena, but obviously with some differences around the sport and so on. So maybe if we can start off with that same opening question, really, can you just tell us something about what role sport played for you in your younger days, growing up, before your transition? What kind of role did sport have in your life?
Okay, so I guess previous to me transitioning, I wasn't involved in any sport really. I'd only ever played football, cricket, golf, tennis at school. So once I left school, I went to work and I just became a 9 till 5, went home, and I did have a partner at the time, but I wasn't involved in any men's teams, or I didn't play on a men's side as such. It wasn't something that really interested me at the time. It was only after I transitioned, that's when I got involved with football, and that was purely through mutual friends. And it was a group of girls asked me to go along one Sunday to like a young mums like get fit sort of kick around.
Yeah.
And I did that for a few months, and after being with them, and like Helena was saying, how you just get accepted for being who you are, and you just become part of like a little team. It was only after being there that I actually thought about, I wonder if I could join an actual 11-a-side side. Sorry, my low battery just came on.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's how it kind of started.
So wow, that's a really rapid move then, from just the sort of the kick around in the park to playing at in the National League. That's fantastic.
Well, there was a little bit of a stopgap after I was involved with the mums and the Get Fit. I originally applied to be at Oadby and Wigston, which is a grassroots side, just local to me, and I emailed them to say if there was any spaces available and I wanted to come down and train. And they emailed me back straight away and offered me to come down on a Thursday night. So as you can imagine, as a trans woman who's never really been involved on a team as such, I was really nervous approaching. I'd driven into the car park, I was sat in my car, and I actually couldn't get out. I could see all the girls on the field huddled around the manager, obviously having like a chat before they got going. And I was actually shaking because I just didn't know how they would accept me for me. It was so difficult, but I built up the courage to walk over, and obviously all these eyes are on you, like you just don't know what to think. But after you get going and the session ended, we had a brief chat with the manager, and it was amazing just to feel like I was part of that, and it kind of grew from there, really.
Were you a goalkeeper from the start, Chloe? Was that always your position?
No, not at all. I actually played on the right wing, but I'm a little bit older now. I'm 38 now. So I mean, I'm playing with girls that are in the 20s, early 20s, mid 20s. So I've lost a lot of my speed and my stamina, like Helena was saying, and the older I get, the further down the field I've gone.
Oh well, I'm sure you're doing a great job. So I can really understand that sort of second thought moment as do I go, because obviously partly that's about moving into any new club or community setting, the unknown going on there, but then your biography as well is so important there. So did the club have all the kind of protocols in place to support you? Did they know the regulations, the paperwork? Was that all fine? Were they good with that?
Okay, so before I approached the club, I kind of knew that I would need to speak to the FA to get some kind of guidance whether I would be allowed to play on a women's side. And the FA checks obviously various things. They want to make sure that you're living as a woman and that is your chosen gender. They check your passports, your driving licenses, and they also want to see your hormone levels. They want to make sure that they're in the female range. So your testosterone has come right down, and obviously your estrogen has gone way up. And obviously I'm on patches now, and my hormones are all within that range. So when I approached the club, they were a little nervous because they have never obviously had a transgender player, and they did say to me, was actually sat in the clubhouse at the time. There was me, my manager, the captain, the club secretary, and there was somebody else there, and it was kind of nerve-wracking. And they said, look, we're glad that you've chose our team, but we've never had a trans player. What do we do if someone says something? And I said, oh, I've got this letter from the FA, approval to play letter. And they were like, oh, wow, this is amazing. Like, as far as that they were concerned, that was like that was, you know, they could refer them on to the FA if anyone had any issues. And yeah, I've only ever had one issue.
Okay, what happened there?
So it was a couple of years ago. It was a fierce local derby, and they had quite a lot of fans that came down to support them, and a club photographer, which is always really nice because it's nice for all of us to get sort of action shots when you're on the field and you can post them over your social media. And after the game, we went back to the clubhouse, had dinner, and then we all obviously went off home. Later that evening, I got a phone call to say, have you been on Facebook or Instagram? And I said, oh, not as yet. Well, the photos had been uploaded from the game, and then there was a lot of really nasty comments from their supporters over various pictures of myself, just being really horrible, saying that I can't believe we've come to watch a women's team and there's a bloke playing. What was that bloke in a wig? It was one of those moments where I hadn't dealt with that before, and I didn't know how to deal with it. And all my teammates were so supportive. It was unreal because I felt a little bit embarrassed, to be honest. I felt like, could they see that about me still? Like, I just didn't like. It was horrible.
Yeah. But were the club were very supportive, though, were they? Was action taken against
Absolutely,
the comments?
The club were amazing. We sat down with my manager and we discussed what we wanted to do about it. And I didn't want it to happen again, and I didn't want anyone else to have to deal with that. And we ended up taking the opposing club to the FA to be sanctioned, and that all went through and they were dealt with appropriately. But since then, I've had nothing but love and support from everybody, a bit like what Helena was saying. And it's just been amazing. And I did move on from Oadby, and I'm now with Bedworth, and I play in goal, and I've been with them for 2 years now, which I absolutely love.
Fantastic. I guess there's no games going on at the moment, though, are there? You must be missing it.
No, I am missing it, but it has been nice to have a break. I can go to work on a Monday not having any aches or pains at the moment.
Well, hopefully you'll be back in action soon. That's really interesting to hear, Chloe. Thanks. I guess my last question, exactly the same question as I went to Helena, really, is if you could give one piece of advice to younger people, particularly students who are in the audience now, who are involved in clubs, sports clubs, sports societies, one bit of advice for how they could make more trans inclusive, what would it be?
I think if somebody was in my position that was potentially looking to join a club as such, definitely just, stop thinking about it, just do it, just get involved, because that support network that those girls or boys that can offer you afterwards to be part of a team has done so much more for my transition. Like I was saying before, before I was involved in a team, I was kind of a bit of a recluse. I didn't have many friends. I kind of just did my own thing. But since being involved with the team, it's just opened up so many more avenues for me. Yeah.
Fantastic. Listen, thank you so much, Chloe. Obviously, you'll be joining us again in a moment for the panel. But before we move into that, I just very quickly want to thank both Chloe and Helena for their stories and sharing that experience. An incredibly wise person once said to me, what's the point of having experience if you can't share it? And I really want to thank Chloe and Helena for that. So what we're going to do now, I'm looking on the side chat, and there's 9 questions already come in, which is fantastic. But I think what would be good if we could maybe just get all 4 speakers back together and just have a very quick chat about some of these points. But I think with this volume of questions coming in, we can move very quickly to the Q&A. So welcome back, everyone, to the power of virtual events. I can see you all again. Hi, everyone. A couple of themes I think I just wanted to bring out from some of that. One is the really big question, I guess, is role models. As a historian, I've worked in various ways on groups of people who have been marginalized or oppressed or disempowered in sport, often talking about how role models have made a big difference to them. So I'm thinking of the role that maybe Pele played for Black British footballers in the 60s and 70s, Tammy Gray-Thompson for wheelchair athletes, Billie Jean King for women. And particularly linking into Joanna's points about how underrepresented numerically trans women, trans athletes are in sport. I wondered if any of you had any thoughts on that. What place is there for role models? And not forgetting, of course, I think Chloe and Helena are absolutely role models in their own right. But any observations on the role of role models?
I think if you can see someone else who's done it and they've done it successfully or without any problems, that can be inspiring in some ways, because you know it can be done. I think partly one of the issues is sometimes you think, well, I'm going to be the first person doing this, and it's almost too much hassle. But if you know it's been done before, then why can't you do it? Is essentially would be my view to it.
Excellent, thank you. So the pioneers there, that's great. Any of the other panelists have a view on that, on the place of role models here?
Yeah, I think I didn't mention it previously, but I'm also an athlete. I'm a distance runner, and when I transitioned in 2004, was very shortly after that I saw an article on another trans woman who was a distance runner, and I certainly found that very inspiring. Again, that I wasn't the only one out there, and you know, that there was a place for me. So yeah, role models are a very big thing.
That's great, thanks. Excellent. Joanna and Gemma, I've got one, I guess, to bring together some of what, Chloe and Helena, to bring together some of what Gemma and Joanna were talking about. So obviously they're looking at some of the rules, the regulations, the research that's going on. I guess I'm really interested to know what view Chloe and Helena, you have as the athletes who are sort of working within the regulations. The people like Gemma and Joanna are helping to research, and in some cases actually helping to inform. Is the relationship strong there? Is it good to have athlete voice when coming up with the advice and the regulations? Interested to know how the two sides work there.
Well, I think one of the issues with the regulations, I think this is the obvious point from my point of view. It depends. You know, I think there's three considerations. It's the sport itself.
Yeah.
It's the age of the competitor, and it's the level of competition. And I think those are the three variables. Now, hockey is a non-contact sport. Mm-hmm. It's a sport that can be played as a mixed team anyway. So that, you know, but it's very much a non-contact sport. I'm at the stage in my, and I'll use the term loosely, career, where, you know, let's be honest, I'm not going to get any better. So, you know, I'm playing competitive league hockey, but we're not talking national league or anything. We're talking, and you know, I think those are the considerations. It's the sport itself. It's the age at which you are, and I'm, you know, as Martin said, the wrong side of 50, and it's a non-contact sport. If all those factors were significantly different, if I was younger, if I was playing a contact sport, and if I was playing at a higher level, those rules and regulations might have more bearing on my ability to participate.
Really interesting.
From a hockey point of view, there's no restrictions.
Gemma and Joanna, can I maybe ask you, in what ways do you, actually probably this is more Joanna because of the consultancy you've done with the IOC and other feds. Can you maybe just talk us through briefly how you do bring athlete voice into the advice that you give?
You know, I certainly think that it is important to have athletes at the table. And, you know, when I first consulted with the IOC in 2015, they'd been having these talks for 30 years, and I was the first trans person in the room, let alone trans athlete. There was an intersex woman in the room as well, but you know, having our voices in there was certainly important. You know, we were still 2 of 20 people, but we were absolutely listened to, and people paid us a lot of respect, and that was a very important thing.
That's really good. Thanks. Good to hear. I'm going to ask one more question, but then we're going to go to the public questions. We've got 11 in the chat bar now, which is fantastic. And this was, it really resonates with, I think, what Chloe was saying about receiving the abusive comments online and then acting on it immediately. To me, that really resonates with what we're trying to do here at De Montfort University with the No Space for Hate, to encourage people to report and to follow procedures through. A question, I guess, for all of you is that something that you've seen happening more in sport? Are people gaining confidence to call out abuse when it happens? Or is this still an area where people might feel, well, you know, I'll keep my head below the parapet, I don't want to draw attention to it, it might only make the haters hate even more? How does that play out in your experience?
I think there's been a massive shift over the last 5 years in kind of all kinds of discrimination being called out a lot more. So in terms of racial discrimination, but also things like the Me Too movement, you know, not even related to sport, but has sort of empowered people to speak out more. So I think it's changing, but it depends where you're talking. At grassroots levels, that's, you know, so much down to an individual's own experience, because it's they haven't got governing bodies necessarily and coaches and people like that protecting them. So I think it probably is harder at the grassroots level, even though, as Helena says, other aspects are easier because the rules and regulations are maybe not as tight.
But Chloe, can I come back to, thanks Gemma, Chloe, when you did report the abuse you were getting, was that a very smooth process to go through? You were supported through it?
Yeah, obviously it wasn't very nice to actually go through it all. I mean, because it was put on social media, there was like evidence for us there to then present to the FA to say, look, you know, this isn't acceptable. Like, I just want to go out and play football on a Sunday without being abused. And luckily they were quite swift in reprimanding that club. So yes, it was a fairly easy process in the end.
That's great. Good, but again, hopefully we can, from very much from the outside, you know, it does sound there's some positive noises coming about things becoming more progressive. Right, what we're going to do, we're going to go through questions now. We've got 12 in the chat bar, and what I'd like to do, I'm going to scroll back to question 1, which is way back up here. So let's go for question 1. Katie, are you able to bring that up, please? Thank you. So the question from Anna. Welcome, Anna. So Anna's question was very specifically to Gemma. So may I ask you about the all-gender weightlifting event? How do they categorise and monitor ability? So Gemma, question for you.
So there were 4 activities that participants would take part in, and they're categorised according to their maximum weight limits. So there's level 1, 2 and 3, and they correspond to different weight limits that somebody could lift in this instance. So participants would self-select to what category they should be in based on their ability, and that's actually completely common in most novice and intermediate competitions of this nature, as in single sex competitions. That's kind of standard procedure. So it was just taking the standard procedure and just using it in an all gender inclusive environment. And obviously if somebody clearly looks like they are taking the mick a bit, then, you know, then that would be picked up on. But as I said, it's just, that's the standard way that it happens in these competitions. Great,
thanks. And Anna actually has a second question as well, which was straight to Joanna. Obviously, Anna wrote this while Joanna was speaking. So if you can bring up Anna's second question, please. So Anna to Joanna, firstly, just to say I think you're great. I've seen you on TV before. Can I ask, what about physical factors that don't change from hormone therapy?
Well, the physical factors fall into 3 categories broadly. There are those that change completely. Hemoglobin levels will go, for trans women, will go from male hemoglobin to female hemoglobin levels within 3 or 4 months. And that's why you saw on the slide the very rapid change in the distance running time, because hemoglobin, red blood cell count, is very important for endurance athletes. Then there are things that will change partially. Trans women will lose strength. they're but they won't lose all of the strength advantage that they had. And then there are those that change either minimally or not at all, such as height. And so in sports like basketball or netball, trans women would definitely maintain whatever height advantage they had through puberty. Of course, in sports like gymnastics, where it's better to be smaller, then trans women are at a huge disadvantage in those sports. But so there are these three categories, and there are many team sports, of course, are a combination of these, and so it's a lot more complex when you look at team sports, which are a combination of these categories. But broadly speaking, some change entirely, some change partially, and some don't change at all.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna. And I think the next question is also for Joanna. This obviously came in while you were speaking, which again is about the physical differences. So this is from Max. Really, thank you, Max. Really interesting lecture. With regards to the change in the 5K times shown and elite sport, does that suggest that a certain point in hormonal therapy should be reached before meaningful, then it goes into the next bubble, before meaningful competition can be met? If so, how can this be implemented fairly in reality? So the question is there a certain point in hormone therapy that should be reached before the athlete can fairly take part in competition?
So first of all, let's make sure we're talking about elite sports. In community level sports, we should just let people play, but this question does refer specifically to elite sports. And yes, for instance, World Athletics requires that trans women bring their testosterone levels down below 5 nanomoles per liter and keep them there for 12 continuous months before being allowed to compete in elite level athletics competition. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable rule. And the hemoglobin levels won't take 12 months to come down, but some other things will, and some things won't change at all. So, I think that for elite level sports like athletics, this 12-month hormone therapy requirement is perfectly reasonable.
Thank you, Joanna. Thanks. So question 4 we've got coming in from Arjith. Welcome, Arjith Ravi. And this, I guess, goes to Chloe and Helena. Some of this we've maybe touched on already, but please, anyone who wants to come in on this. So Arjith's question is, how was the level of acceptance by the public when you took sport as your career? I'm not sure who wants to start on that one. Chloe, maybe?
Sorry, can you just say the question again?
Yeah, sure. Sorry. So Arjith's question is, how was the level of acceptance by the public when you took sport as your career?
Well, I've not actually, sport isn't my career. I play football on a Sunday predominantly. I do play in the National League, but publicly, I've not had any issues apart from that one circumstance we've spoken about already. I think when you think about the videos that you see online of goalkeepers that are stood there in the goal and the abuse that is actually hurled at them from behind the net, that would be like my worst fear ever. But thankfully that hasn't happened as yet.
Excellent, thank you. And Helena, maybe for some of the people that you're working with as well, do you get a sense of in the time that you've been working in this area, do you get any sense that levels of acceptance have improved or declined or stayed the same?
I think that's a very difficult one, because I think at various different points in time there can be news articles, if you like, which can focus on one particular sport, which can bring that particular subject to people's attention, but that could possibly die down and the focus can go on other sports. So I think it very much depends on what's the hot topic at the time. I mean, from my point of view, again, I don't have sports as a career. I play on a Saturday afternoon and nobody comes to watch. So outside of the world that I play in, then who cares?
A bit like when we're at university together there.
Absolutely, yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, question 5 is from Anna again, and this goes to Helena. Thank you for sharing. Do you know of any other organisations similar to LEAP that operate in England?
Yes.
Anna's, yeah. Helena.
Absolutely. There's a sister organisation called Pride Sports, which essentially is I won't say the English equivalent because that might be slightly unfair, but it's our sister organisation within England. So they have their own website, which is let me get this right, pridesports.org.uk, and they essentially work to achieve the same sort of thing that we work towards. So yeah, Pride Sports is the equivalent in England, and there is an equivalent in Wales as well, if anyone's interested.
Thank you. And you said you also have some European partner organisations?
Yes, we do. We work with a number of organisations across Europe.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, next one is coming from Jan, and this is, I know, something that certainly when you talk at level of grassroots, trying to understand what goes on. And this is a question about changing rooms. So Jan asks, what will happen about changing rooms? Women need sanitary products. Some women want to breastfeed. So there's other themes going on in there. But it's the thorny question of changing rooms. Any perspectives from any of our panelists?
I don't really understand the question, actually. I don't think there's any implication for changing rooms. People generally can use whichever changing room they feel comfortable in, and loads of places now have neutral changing rooms if you prefer that. But I don't think that's really relevant.
Okay, thanks. Any other comments from any of the other panelists?
Yeah, I don't think that that women who would want who would choose to breastfeed in the changing room, it shouldn't make any difference whether a trans woman was in that room or not.
Yeah. So absolutely, this is one of those things that's not really a conversation within communities. Is it more outside the community that this conversation is happening? Yeah, thanks. I think a bit of a resigned nod from Helena there. Thanks very much. Thank you. Jan then has another question. So as I understand it, around this is question 7, around 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 500 people may be transgender. Huge range there. Do we have any stats or numbers? There's already exclusion of disabled children and adults. Can we find inclusion for them? Again, I'm not quite sure exactly where that question's going, Jan. Do any of the panelists have any immediate responses to that?
Well, there are a lot of different surveys on the population of trans, and they use different methodologies and they come up with different numbers. But most people would say that trans population is a little higher than 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 500, more like 1 in 100 or 1 in 150. I certainly think that we should try to find inclusion for for disabled people. I think the Paralympics is an extraordinarily important endeavor, and I don't think that including trans athletes in sport will in any way take away from the Paralympics.
Thank you. Absolutely. I think that for me, the conversation it's about recognizing groups that have been traditionally marginalized and making sure sport works for everybody. Thank you for that. Question 8 is coming in from Lauren, and this goes to Helena. But again, anyone else who wants to come in. So Lauren asks, thank you for sharing your experiences, Helena. I have one quick question. What advice would you give to a trans or non-binary person thinking of getting involved in sport or physical activity? Thanks, Lauren.
Do it. Would be my quite simply, do it. If you want something to happen, then go out there and make it happen. And it might be, in my experience, most of the problems are in your own head half the time. So go out there and make it happen. If you want to get involved, there will be people out there who will welcome you and enable you to get involved. So do it.
Thank you. Chloe, did you have anything from there? Again, that was really resonating with your, kick around in the park and leading on to bigger things. Did you have anything to add for Lauren there?
Yeah, I mean, we have the most amazing tool to use, and that is the internet. When people are struggling or don't know where to turn to if they wanting to join the local club, all they've got to put into Google in the search bar is look at your local football teams, your local girls teams, local boys teams, and on there will be a list. Just click one and send an email across. And if they're worried about how they're going to be perceived, then just look at me and Helena. We've been welcomed in with open arms, and it's one of the best things I've ever done joining the team.
Thank you. That's really, really good to hear. Thanks. Next up, now this is one that could be really interesting for a number of areas. I think definitely for Chloe, as you play in a contact sport, and I'd be really interested to hear Gemma and Joanna as well. So this is a question line coming in from Meg, and Meg says, as a rugby player, I would love to hear all participants' opinions on how to be inclusive for trans players in contact sport. So again, Helena, although as you've said about hockey not being contact sport, any perspectives you have from projects you work with as well. So this can really go out to everyone. Advice for how to be inclusive for trans players in contact. And who wants to start on that one?
Well, include them would be the way to be inclusive, but certainly, look, there's absolutely a potential safety issue in rugby, and it's been in the news a lot. I certainly don't think that World Rugby's ban at an international level is justified, but certainly their concern over potential safety issues is justified. And I would suggest that there's a lot more work that would need to be done on exactly what happens with those trans women who play rugby. Do we have any statistics, for instance, that it is any more dangerous? I don't believe that we do it at this point. So I think a lot of research needs to be done about that. But again, at a lower level, I think we should, to include, we'd be inclusive. And but it needs to be recognized that in contact sports, there is a potential safety issue.
Yeah, absolutely. As there is for all players, regardless of background. Chloe, did you have any observations on that? Again, obviously, playing as a goalkeeper in football, I'm sure you get clattered a fair amount. Any observations on that to help Meg?
What I would say is that I was put on my bum a fair few more times than I put anyone else on their bums. Look, people are all different, strengths and sizes. I've come across people that a lot bigger than me. They've given me a few shoves. It's part of the game in football. We're not there to hurt anyone maliciously. I'm just there to play and enjoy.
Thanks. And Gemma, this question from Meg really resonates well with your comments about the weightlifting, which is about and the issues that you're bringing in there. Did you have anything to comment on this for next question about rugby players?
Rugby's under a massive spotlight at the moment anyway with regards to concussion. So, in the male game and in the female game. So I think if that's an issue within those games as they stand, so the safety concern is there, as you just alluded to, the safety concern is there nonetheless. And at the moment, we don't have the data, but as Joanna said, if you look at the average male athlete and average female athlete, we would think that maybe there's a reason to be concerned about that. But again, it all depends on what happens after a period of time on hormone therapy, and we just don't know those answers yet.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much. So we've got about 10 minutes or so left, and there's still a few questions there. I think we've probably got time to do them all, I hope. So let's see how we go. So the next one came from question 10, coming in from Abigail Roberts. Abigail, hi. How important do you think LGBTQ+ exclusive coaching services are to participation in sport in regards to addressing factors such as health inequalities and the examples Abigail gives around nutrition and strength and conditioning coaching? So Panel, any comments there on LGBTQ plus exclusive coaching services?
Well, I would just say that when you're looking at elite athletes particularly, nutrition is massively important. So is the psychology of participation. So there's loads of work that's done around kind of motivation and flow and psychological state in terms of performance metrics. And it makes sense to me that people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community may have a different set of issues that need supporting. So if we're talking about psychological flow and focus on your game, I know from talking to trans athletes, there's other things going on for them that a cis athlete would never experience. So actually targeted support would be really good. And again, with somebody who is on hormonal intervention, there'll be different implications of that for health, bone health, nutrition. So actually, yeah, completely. And, you know, hopefully this is something that might develop over the next few years, people that are specialising in supporting athletes.
Thank you. Did any of the other panelists have any view on the exclusive coaching services there? No, all good, brilliant. Thanks very much, Gemma. So we'll move to question 11, which is Arjith again. Hi again, and that's about sponsorship. Really interesting question. So our sponsors upcoming, our sponsors getting on board to support trans athletes. This has been obviously a really interesting thing in the development of LGBT clubs. I know of people like the King's Cross Steelers and so on. Is there anything, and maybe Helena, possibly this goes to you first off, have you noticed any sort of sponsorship opportunities?
I think at a local level, we support a number of LGBTI clubs. They have attracted local sponsorship, which might essentially be around buying kit or something, or providing sort of ancillary services for the clubs. But that is as normal, really. You know, local sports clubs go out to their local community and ask for a sum of money to help them through the next season. So I think at a local level that can happen and does happen. In terms of sponsoring individual athletes or at a higher level, I couldn't comment on that other than to say that no one's ever suggested that they would want to sponsor me.
Now's your chance to pitch, Helena.
I did.
There are a couple of trans athletes in the United States who found corporate sponsorship on an individual level. Multi-sport athlete Chris Mosier, who's a trans man, has been sponsored by Nike. Jillian Bearden, who's a trans female cyclist, has been sponsored by Specialized. So, you know, in some rare cases, yes, trans athletes have found individual sponsorship.
That's really good to know. Thank you. Thank you so much, Joanna. Okay, next question. Actually, this is one where I can be the person to say just do it. This is a question from 7B. Any advice for someone who is potentially interested in sport research but is intimidated at the thought of writing a dissertation? I'll start that off, and I'm just going to quote Helena and Chloe, just do it. But I will pass that over to the people working in the area. So any advice for people who are thinking of doing research in this area, but they're feeling intimidated at the prospect?
Well, I'm feeling intimidated by the prospect of writing my thesis, and I'm doing it. So, and I'm certainly no spring chicken anymore. But how about if I turn it over to Gemma for more comments?
Yeah, I think there's nothing to be intimidated about. I think that the main things are always just to think about what it is, what's your research question and why is it important? It always comes back to that kind of so what? So what are you going to find and why is that important? And the writing bit. And, you know, Joanna will attest to this as well. Students get help with developing those skills. You're not meant to be amazing off the bat. That's not what the point of doing a PhD or a master's degree is about. It's about development. So if you're interested, find an institution or a supervisor that you think would be able to support you and go for it and see what happens.
Thanks. I think I just echo Joanna and Gemma there, that, you know, if you're nervous that you want to work on a subject that you think a university won't be interested in, then just look at what Gemma is doing and look at what Joanna's doing in really pushing different research projects here. So Really good luck with that. And again, feel free, just contact academics to chat about what you're interested in. Thank you. We have 2 more questions. So the penultimate one comes from Charlotte, question 13. Welcome, Charlotte. Do you believe that treating gender as something that can be given a grade in a system similar to that used in some parasports? I know wheelchair basketball uses this, for example. So could that grading system be a way forward so that all athletes, including cis, could be graded? This resonates a little bit, I think, with some of the weightlifting stuff you were talking about, Gemma, but this is maybe going a little bit further. So this is about grading for all athletes to allow, presumably, open competition. Any observations on that?
Joanna's written a nice paper on this, I think.
Joanna, go for it.
To answer that.
I think, first of all, I think that things like limitless are really terrific. And I think that, we should explore all sorts of alternatives to the male-female binary. But I think, especially when it comes to team sports at an elite level, I think we're probably stuck with the binary for now. And I think it's especially important for female athletes. If we want to see women winning Olympic medals and getting professional sports contracts, then we have to have a women's division. If we were trying to set up, say, English football teams, national teams, at all sorts of different levels between male and female, it would be very challenging to get teams, and then for the English teams, if we did get them, to find other countries to compete against. But I think certainly at grassroots levels, we should explore all kinds of other ideas.
Thank you. Thanks. Gemma, did you have anything to add on that one?
Just sort of echoing what Joanna said, really. I think as an idea, as a concept, it's something worth exploring. But I think with a lot of the things in this issue, they will work for some sports, they won't work for others. They might work for individual sports, not for team sports. So there's never going to be a blanket kind of solution.
Sure. Thank you. And so the last question coming in from Richard is slightly similar ground, but I think a bit different. And Richard writes, fantastic discussion. So thank you to all the contributors. Richard, you're doing my job for me there. Based on the current best evidence, what are your views on the discussion around trans athletes competing against, and with as well, cis athletes at elite level? So do any of you have anything to add to that wasn't covered in the last question?
Well, the one thing I would say is that given how, different parameters change in different ways, I think that we should probably look in the future in a sports-specific sense. And so the rules that work for athletics might not be the same rules in play for rugby. But having said that, I think that that sports can come up with rules that will allow fair, meaningful, and safe competition for all athletes, even at elite levels. And so that I don't think we should be looking at banning trans athletes, but finding rules that will allow inclusion of trans athletes while maintaining meaningful and safe sport for all.
Thank you. Excellent. Listen, we're out of time. I cannot thank you all enough for your time, for your collegiality, for your honesty and candor in the stories that you've told, for the inspiration that I know you will all have given, whether that's about people getting involved in playing sport, in helping to run sports clubs, or indeed in getting involved in further research. And I think that, for my money at least, this has absolutely done what we wanted to do in terms of educate, inform, and empower. So it really remains for me to thank very, very much, very sincerely, Chloe, Elena, Gemma, and Joanna for their contributions tonight. Thank you again to the colleagues who have made all of this possible, and the backroom people who've kept this amazing technology in flow all through. And thank you to the audience for your attention, for your wonderful questions, for your engagement. And I really hope that this has helped you to think more clearly and more critically about the issues facing transgender athletes in sport. So thank you all and good night.